As we go into the story, the biblical account of Gideon, I want to focus our attention especially on verse 14 of Judges chapter 6, where we have most clearly the call of God to Gideon. The Lord turned to Gideon and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Beloved in our Lord Jesus Christ, I want to imagine a scenario with me, and I want you to see this same scenario that may seem quite familiar to you, actually. I want to imagine that you have been born and raised in a Christian environment. Most of us here present can identify with being born and raised in a Christian family from our generation and previous generations as well. You're raised in this Christian family, but I want to imagine that as you are living in the environment that we are in here in Canada, here in Toronto, specifically here in Brampton, that there are some changes that are beginning to take place around you. Things are not what they used to be. There was a time when this country here in Canada was considered to be a Christian country. Some still call it a Christian country simply because we have Christian roots. But as we know, and is not hard for us even to imagine, we know that there have been decisions that have been made over the years that have drawn us away from our roots, and things begin to change. I want you to imagine that it even goes further to the point where murder no longer is a punishable crime. But people just simply look the other way. I want you to imagine that stealing, which was once frowned upon, now is a way of life. We just hold our hand over our wallets and over our pocketbooks to make sure that we are not going to be stolen from. And in the midst of that, I want you to imagine that churches are beginning to close their doors. Attendance at services of worship are less and less throughout our communities. And we look around, and I can just sense that we might say, I really want to do something about this. What do I do? But who am I? I really want to be a part of resolution to the problems that we are dealing with. This really is the situation that Gideon finds himself in. As we come to the story of Gideon, the biblical account that God provides for us in His Word, we see, first of all, that Israel is in a desperate condition. From that, we receive, as we follow through on that, Gideon receives a call from God to do something about it. This then is followed up by God saying, I am going to call you and I will give you the equipment that you need in order to do the work that needs to be done. And then we have the account of God's victory in battle as a part of the life of Gideon. The situation that we have just talked about, imagining the situation in Canada, and perhaps even pushing the envelope a little further to where it has not gone to yet, although it may very well be in days and years to come. But that's precisely what we have here in the account, the biblical account of Gideon. Gideon was considered to be one of the great judges of Israel. There's more written in terms of biblical account about Gideon than there is about any of the other judges. His name means smiter or hewer, cutter, if you will. They lived at that time in an idolatrous environment. By the time that Gideon is on the scene, there is rampant worship of Baal. God's people had not only invited those from the nations around them to live among them, but they have accommodated themselves to the lifestyle of the enemy nations that were around them. And as we look at this, we understand that not only are they acknowledging the presence of the enemy, but they have begun to stop fighting against them and their ideas. And they start doing the kind of things that the enemy is doing, including paganistic rituals that were a part of that. Along comes God's punishment to his people through the Amalekites and the Midianites. Now, the Amalekites and the Midianites are nomadic groups. They don't have a home. They travel from place to place to place, and in their travels they plunder and steal and loot and take whatever food is in their path as they travel from place to place. We read in Judges 6 verse 5 that there were so many that they are referred to in Numbers as locusts in chapter 6 verse 5. Chapter 7 verse 12 also identifies the presence of the enemy as being like locusts. I'm sure that the idea that is being conjured up here is that of what had taken place during the 10 plagues when locusts swarmed over Egypt. And that term is being used now here as well. In verses 3 to 5 of chapter 6, we read about the plundering and the stealing of the Midianites. So much so that the Israelites themselves are forced to leave their towns and their villages and their places where they were living and go into the mountains, verse 2 of chapter 6. And this had been going on for 7 years, verse 1. And we read that in verse 6, Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. And then God sends a prophet to them who reminds them of what God has done and warns them to turn back to God. Isn't it true that the same kind of thing can happen in our own generation as well? One generation that knows and follows the Lord, and the second generation that slowly moves away from that central guideline of the Scriptures, and the next generation even further yet and further yet. We only need to look across into Europe, where most of us have our descendants, and see what's happening in Europe to see the same kind of things. But the same thing is happening here in our own country too. In Canada, our political leaders have repeatedly violated treaties with the native Canadian groups. It's not called sin. It's just called an unfortunate circumstance. Our federal government currently is caught up in spending scandals. It's not called sin. It's just a regrettable mistake. In 1994, our federal government struck the name of Jesus Christ from the prayers in the legislature. It didn't even make the evening news. It was considered a political necessity. Sin is no longer called what it is today because nobody wants to face up to the fact that we are sinners. We don't like that message. And our society certainly doesn't like that message. But it's in the midst of that kind of society that God calls us as he calls Gideon. Remember that this people of Israel is the people whom God had called to himself to be a holy people, to reflect who he was. But instead his name is being defamed amongst the nations. People are making fun of this nation of Israel, considered to be God's people, saying, those are God's people, look what's happening to them. These are the people through whom God had promised the coming Messiah. And this people of God in the Old Testament were called upon to live up to that name and live up to that promise, even as you and I today, bearing the name Christian, followers, disciples of Jesus Christ, are called upon to be a part of that ongoing plan of salvation that goes on in our world today. God is at work. What are we doing? Gideon had to face that question. In verses 11 to 24, in the call to Gideon, we understand and know that Israel is wandering. Oh, perhaps they're not wandering physically now in the wilderness, but they certainly are wandering spiritually in a dark, dark world. They're like sheep without a shepherd. But Gideon seems to understand and know that God is still at work. Throughout the history of God and His relationship with His people, there has been times when God's people have wandered away. It happens in our lives each time we sin. But one of the beauties of God's sovereign care over the development of that history of His wonderful message of salvation is that God always maintains a faithful remnant to continue His plan of salvation for the world. Gideon is among that remnant. And when we see this, then we can see that God then basically is saying to Gideon, Gideon, I want you to deliver my people from this oppression that is taking place from the enemy, from the Amalekites and the Midianites. Consider and look at the call that Gideon receives in three different steps. First of all, in verse 12, Gideon is doing his work, threshing his wheat on the threshing floor, and the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, verse 12, and he says to Gideon, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. There's a sense in which this call to Gideon serves as the foundation. Gideon could not do what God was going to call him to do if he did not have the foundation of the presence of God, first of all. Gideon, the Lord is with you. Interesting how Gideon responds to this first step of the call. But, sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of the Midianites. Gideon basically responding to God saying, the Lord is with you, by saying, I believe you, but what has been happening? Have you entirely left us alone? Have you abandoned us completely? Consider where your people are, what has been happening. Consider the oppression from the enemy. Where have you been, God? Does that sound like a familiar question that we sometimes ask? And the beauty of it is that God's answer is that He has always been there. His sovereign hand is working through everything. The good times and the very difficult times that His people go through, God's hand is there, allowing the enemy to do the work that He allows them to do to punish His people, but His sovereign hand holding the enemy back, saying, only up to so far may you go. Satan even is under God's sovereign control. Satan is just a puppet of God. God allows him to wreak havoc, to do his damage, if you will, in this time and in ours, but there are times when God says, okay, Satan, no more. No more. You may want to go so far. What a marvelous God we have to know that God is with us and is faithful to us at all times. Then the Lord turns to him in verse 14 and He says, Gideon, Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? That's our primary text. Notice the response of Gideon. But Lord, you see, Gideon here does not say, okay, I have this talent, I have this ability, I have these gifts, I have these resources. I'm ready. You got the right man. I'm ready to go. Tell me what I need to do. But Gideon doesn't respond that way now, does he? As we perhaps might. The Lord turned to him and he says that, and then in verse 15, but Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Gideon's response basically is, are you sure you got the right person here? I'm from Manasseh. The tribe of Manasseh is least mentioned in the accounts of Scriptures. What comes out of Manasseh? Manasseh, as a matter of fact, is a tribe that was divided between one side of the Jordan River and the other was a divided tribe. And furthermore, Gideon says, my clan is the weakest of all of the clans in Manasseh. And in those weak clans, in that weak clan, my family is the least of that. And as a matter of fact, I'm the one in my family that people are always picking on and thinking very little of. Who do you think I am that I can do this? And God says, you're not going to do it. You are not going to do that. Remember step one. The Lord is with you. And so he says in verse 16, the Lord answers, I will be with you, and you will strike down all of the Midianites together. That's the third part. The affirmation of God's call saying, you're right. You can't do it by yourself. But I will be with you. And Gideon then replies, if now I've found favor in your sight, give me a sign that reminds me about this. When we see this situation, we need to be reminded of the fact that as God is speaking to Gideon, saying, the Lord is with you, and I am calling you, and affirming that I will be with you, that's what he is doing to the church of Jesus Christ today as a church, and that's what he's doing to each and every one of us here today as well. Because when we live in the situation in which we are living in here in Canada, and as a matter of fact, if you look at the worldwide situation, you and I might very easily say, well, I'm only 6 years old. I'm only 10 years. I'm only a teenager. I don't have my education yet. I don't have gifts. I don't have the talents. I'm a busy mom. I have a full-time job. And how many excuses that we can come up with in saying, I'm not able to do this. And imagine God then saying, you're right. Thank you for acknowledging in humility that you can't do it. So far, so good. But guess what? Go anyways. Because you are not going in your own strength. You're going in my strength. This is not your battle. This is my battle. And I will give you what you need in order to be able to do what needs to be done in this battle that is going on in our world today. God is not looking for talents and gifts and resources and the things that we think that we can do as though we were going in our own effort. God is looking for two things that he found in Gideon and he's looking for in us. Number one, are you faithful? Do you love the Lord? Number two, are you available? Will you obey God when he says, go? right where you are. You don't have to go off to Papua New Guinea or Brazil or other parts of the world. There are those who will be called to that, perhaps among us here. But right where you are, God says, here is what I've called you to. I have placed you in this community for a reason. I have put you in your job for a purpose. I have given you your family in that community where you live for a reason. I have put you into this school and that study situation for a reason. I know what I'm doing, says God, when I send you right where you are. That's what we begin to understand and know. It's not as though Gideon says, I'm going to flex my muscles, I'm going to gather my army together. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And I'm going to do what needs to be done. He does not go in his own confidence. He doesn't go under a self-realization, I can do this. Chapter 6, verse 34. Where does his power come from? Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. That's the heart of it. And he blew a trumpet and summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and into Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, the various tribes of Judah and Israel at that time, so that they too went up to meet him. Does that sound like a focus on self-realization? That I can do it? The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. By the way, that term came in the original language, properly translated would be, and the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. It's as if God puts his clothing of power over Gideon. It means equipped. And the Spirit of the Lord equipped Gideon. And so Gideon seeks then a confirmation from God. In the same way that those who are called to formal ministry, perhaps in this situation, might sense that God is calling them to a public ministry, but they are looking for the confirmation of God through the study program and through the call of a local church to whatever ministry they may be called to. That's where the confirmation comes. I sense the call, but now let me have this confirmed. That's what Gideon is doing when he lays out this fleece before the Lord. I want a confirmation. I sense that call. I hear that call now. Now confirm that for me. And now then, if I put out this fleece, and we read this in verses 36 to 40. God, I want you to show me a sign and confirmation that the ground will be dry and the fleece moist with dew. And God does it. Can you do this one more time? Says Gideon. That's his personal confidence being shaken yet in terms of what he needs to do. He wants to be absolutely certain that God is the one who's going to be doing this because he can't. So he says, God, can you do this again and make the fleece moist and wet and the ground be dry? Can you do that? God does it. God says, I'm the one in control here. It was his demonstration, confirmation, affirmation that it is God who is going to do his work through this very weak Gideon, if you will. Remember Hebrews 11, verse 33, that we read, in strength, in weakness, they found their strength and routed out the enemy. That specifically relates from the author of Hebrews what was happening to Gideon. And God says to Gideon, the Spirit of the Lord equipped Gideon, clothed with Gideon. With what equipment? What equipment do we have? What resources do we have in order to be able to do this battle against the enemy? What resources did Gideon have? As we look into our own communities, particularly here in the Greater Toronto area, we know that there are different religious groups that are a part of our community. If we do a study of world religions, we'll see many, many different religions being practiced in our own communities. I have the privilege of teaching at this time a course through Word and Spirit Institute on world religions. And to do that, we are studying the Muslim religion and the Sikh religion, two of the predominant religions here in the Toronto area. And I remember some years ago talking about equipment. What do we have? What strength, by what strength do we go? I had a conversation with a Muslim several years ago. And in that conversation, this Muslim, I was sitting at a Tim Hortons with him. And he said to me, he says, all due respect, and there's different religions here in Toronto. And I know that you are a Christian because you have identified yourself as such. But the Christian religion is one of the weakest religions in the Greater Toronto area. I wasn't upset. He's not offending me. He's offending God when he says that. So I wasn't upset at all. I simply asked him, so why would you say that? Just wondering what makes you think that. He says, we Muslims have 5 pillars on which we base our faith. I said, what are they? And he knew them well. Well, he says, it is proclaiming that Allah is God and Muhammad is his prophet, and repeating that over and over. That's one of the pillars. And fasting is another one of those pillars of the faith for the Muslim. Pilgrimage to Mecca, daily prayers, and almsgiving. Those 5 pillars. He says those are 5 solid pillars on which we build our faith. And he says, the Sikhs are not as strong as we are in their religion because they only have 3 pillars. Work, worship, and service to the community. That's the 3 pillars for them. But he said, you Christians have only 1 pillar. One pillar. And I asked him, what is that 1 pillar? He said to me, like any good evangelist would, it is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. That's exactly the words that he used. I asked him how he was doing in satisfying what he needed to do to attain salvation following those 5 pillars that he had. I said, have you been to Mecca yet? He was a young man. No, I haven't been to Mecca yet. So I said, if you die tomorrow, you will not have accomplished what needs to be accomplished. No, but he said, I've got plans. I'll go. I said, when you are ill and you have a really bad day, do you pray 5 times? I mean, you're supposed to do that 5 times every day and reciting the words, Allah is God, Muhammad is my prophet. Wow, he said, who can do that all the time? I mean, I said, so you don't really accomplish all that needs to be done. I pointed out the same thing with the Sikhs in terms of their 3 pillars and how they fail to be able to accomplish what needs to be accomplished for them in terms of salvation. I said, now let's look at that 1 pillar that you identify as being the weakest pillar. That pillar of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary. I said, the difference is this. My right to say that I have been granted salvation has nothing to do with what I do. It has been done for me by Jesus Christ. No effort of my own. And by God's grace, on Calvary, I am saved. Well, he didn't know how to respond to that one. We've had some conversations through the years since that time. But that's what we need to understand and know, that we have the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that it is the Christian religion, the biblical religion, is the only religion in the entire world, of all of the world religions, in which we don't have to make our own effort to get salvation, whatever that means in the various religions, but it has been done for us simply for the asking, as we are nudged along by God's Holy Spirit. That 1 pillar becomes the strongest pillar that could ever be, because God is the mightiest and his grace is the most profound. That's the message that we have as we go into battle against the enemy. When God talks to us about providing what we need, in Ephesians chapter 6, he spells out for us what He has given to us as gifts is what we need in order to be able to do the battle that God has called us to, as He has called Gideon to do that. In verses 14 to 17 of Ephesians chapter 6, we have the belt of truth, we have the breastplate of righteousness, the shoes of the gospel, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. We don't have to look for our own resources to do this battle, to engage in this battle that God has called us into, any more than Gideon had to look for his own resources. They are given to us. They're there for the asking. When we look into chapter 7 and we see how Gideon prepares himself for battle, that is enforced even more strongly, isn't it? Gideon gathers, he goes around and he gathers 32,000 people of the Israelites to do battle against the enemy. Now we know that in the enemy camp there was at least 120,000, because in chapter 8 verse 12 we read that 120,000 were killed. That doesn't include those who ran into the mountains and left the area. But at least, and let's not exaggerate, at least 120,000, because we know that that's the number that was killed, chapter 8, verse 12. So Gideon is thinking that he's doing pretty good by gathering together 32,000, still depending on God, because what can 32,000 do against 120,000? And God says, 32,000? Too many. Tell those that you have gathered together with you that are afraid, tell them to go home if they're afraid. So they do. He loses 22,000. He's left with 10,000, and he presents them to God and says, God, I think we're ready now. How many do you have? 10,000. God says, too many. And he has them go through an exercise. I'm not going to get into the detail of that, of going down to the river and drinking water from the river that goes through over there. And depending on how they were taking up that water, God whittles that army down to 300. Verses 4 to 7 of chapter 7. And with those 300, Gideon is supposed to go into battle? No, not with those 300. But with the mighty power of God. This is not Gideon's battle. And the battle in which we are engaged in the work of missions and evangelism that goes on in our world today is not our battle. I'm thankful for that. I'm a missionary, and I go across and I do teaching in Central America and countries of South America, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Central American countries. 6 times a year I'm traveling. I'm sure glad I'm not going on my own strength. God goes before me as He goes before each one of us. We need to be reminded of that. And it's amazing when we read about how that battle victory takes place then, because in verses 19, 18 and following, or 19 and following, we read that they are called upon through completely non-conventional means, simply to blow trumpets and breaking of jars and waving of torches and proclaiming in a loud voice for the Lord and for Gideon. This is God's battle. And what we read in verse 21 is that while each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran crying out as they fled. We don't know all the details of exactly what happened. Perhaps there was confusion. Perhaps, we don't know how 120,000 were killed. We don't know. That's not important. The fact is, God was victorious in this battle, because it is not a battle between Gideon and his army and the Amalekites and their army. This was a battle between God and Satan in the perspective of God's work of salvation going on. And the battle that we are doing is exactly that same thing. We are called by God as a church, as individuals, no matter how old you are, wherever you are, to engage in this battle. It's not ours. And because it's not ours, we can just follow our commander, God Himself, and accept those resources and all that we need in order to be able to do this battle, because He is the one who's going to provide what is needed in this battle that He has called us into in our world today. God's army always wins out. Read through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. Read through the history of the Christian church since the time of the close of the New Testament age over the last 2013 years, almost 14, and hear and read about how God routs out the enemy time and time again. Gideon depended on God to deliver his people, and received and was clothed, was equipped with God's Holy Spirit, as are we. Our problem is that we have a tendency to judge how things are and what our involvement is going to be by looking around and saying, so what's out there? What is it? What did they have? What did they have? And what do I have? What do I have? Our eyes are focused on what's around us. Our eyes are focused on ourselves and what we have. But what does the author of Hebrews remind us about? Where we are supposed to have our eyes focused. Chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. And with that, I'm going to conclude. Chapter 12, verse 2 and 3, Hebrews, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men. Why? So that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Congregation, may that be your encouragement. Individuals, each one of us. May we be encouraged by the fact that God is going before us, and all we need to do is follow him as he leads in this battle that he calls us to be engaged in. Amen.